You, my guardian angel, take my soul of fire. In this game, we're double agents.
You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. I'm your host, Jay Dyer. Esoteric Hollywood is where I deconstruct the deeper messages, symbols, and predictive programming subtext that underlie modern film. In this show, we will be interviewing artists, experts, and numerous people in media fields. This will all be based on my years of research in comparative religion, propaganda, psychological warfare, secret societies, and espionage. Esoteric Hollywood decodes the biggest movies in an unparalleled way, from the classics of the silver screen to today's blockbusters. Learn to watch film with completely new eyes as we enter Esoteric Hollywood. Welcome to Esoteric Hollywood. I'm your host, Jay Dyer of jaysanalysis.com. Tonight, I have the other half of Hoaxbusters Call. If you heard last week, I had Chris Kendall, who is the proprietor of Hoaxbusters Call, the interesting and insightful social engineering, media psyops, conspiracy expose, critique blog. And then I have his co-host, John Adams of the Afternoon Commute with me, and we've had so many great discussions and they've been so insightful. And John really is a well of information, a sort of walking encyclopedia of the bizarre and the strange, and I thought it was perfect for Esoteric Hollywood, especially given the fact that John has done some podcasts that are really in depth about the history of California itself. And being a California kid with a dad in the Navy, I experienced many of those same geopolitical and architectural phenomena, I guess is the best way to put it. That just you have to really spend time in California to get a feel for it. It's sort of an existential type of thing, I guess. And California is, of course, the home to Hollywood, which this show is Esoteric Hollywood. So what better topic and subject matter to delve into than the subject of California? Now, we won't be strictly dealing with the topography of California, but John, how are you?
I'm doing well, Jay. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, and as I was saying, I thought the California show that you did, I listened to, I think all 3 hours of it, was very interesting. It brought back a lot of memories from my youthful days of living in California and driving about La Jolla and different beaches and living in Bonita Valley. And then time I would spend up in LA and San Francisco on different trips. And so, yeah, that was a great subject for a podcast that you did. Tell us some of your thoughts about just Hollywood, LA in general. That's a great place to start.
Well, Hollywood, growing up, it was, in the 1980s, it was already pretty run down. It was kind of a parody of itself, as I mentioned in the podcast that we did about it. And it was kind of this nexus for alternative lifestyles, like, I don't know, punk music, and kind of like a revitalization of country music, interestingly enough.
Oh yeah.
But like old country music, and so you had a lot of these neo country band / punk rock musicians.
Like what we call outlaw country here in Nashville in the South.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that became kind of popular again in the 1980s, and kind of rockabilly, hillbilly music as well, all gravitating to Los Angeles, which, interestingly enough, a lot of it got started there. Los Angeles, as well as Nashville, is the home of country music.
Right.
So, there's a lot of history all over the place. But yeah, that's kind of what I remember you get a sense of the layout, and you also it demythifies Hollywood, because as it's shown to you on the television as, you know, glitzy and glamorous and all that type of stuff, it's not that at all. And even though it's been gentrified to a certain extent today, it still is pretty run down overall. So yeah, it is the horror Babylon.
Well, they have that big Babylonian gate, right?
Yes. That's if you want to even go there, that's an interesting subject in and of itself. Is that the movie A.W. Griffith's movie Intolerance, which was filmed in the early part of the 20th century, was based around one of the scenes in the movie is based around Babylon. He actually built a life-size set of Babylon on the corner of Sunset and Hollywood Boulevard, and it actually sat there in decay for many years. So and I'm sure you've read Hollywood Babylon by Kenneth Anger, and he kind of uses that as a allegorical, using it in an allegorical context for the Babylon that is Hollywood, with the scandals and gossip and all sorts of things of that nature as well.
Right. Well, if you're just now tuning in, you're listening to Esoteric Hollywood, and I'm talking to my Hollywood correspondent, Mario Lopez, who's on the scene checking out the paparazzi story there with... can you see Lindsay Lohan from where you are? Or are you getting a glimpse of what's up her skirt? Can you see?
Oh, yeah, actually, I'm not able to see past, never mind, I was going to say something kind of raunchy, but...
Well, I was going to say, when you look up there, I guess you can see Charlie Sheen was here, right? It's written underneath the Lindsay Lohan skirt. Right?
Yeah, bro.
I'm a rock star from Mars, bro.
That's Charlie Sheen. That's interesting. So if we could start with something there, I've been thinking about something for a long time, and this will actually be a good opportunity to talk about this. Is the advent of the teen movie?
Yes, that's a great topic.
And I've been working on this in my mind for quite a while. And one of the things I came across, and interestingly enough, Aaron Franz touched on this in one of his podcasts, was how the 1980s was all about invigorating the youth.
Yes.
It's all about forever young and being, and so what you see with a lot of these Brat Pack movies in the 1980s, it's very interesting. And,
yes.
I
was going to say that the first thing that comes to mind when you bring up this subject is Styles from Teen Wolf and the black shades and the T-shirt that says, "What are you looking at, Dick Nose?" Yeah.
I mean, you can see that it didn't go too well for the youth overall once you get into Teen Wolf 2.
Right. Well, Jason Bateman, of course, did have a comeback here recently, post Arrested Development, but absolutely it was Jason Bateman, right, that was in Teen Wolf 2, if I recall.
Yes, he is the poor man's Michael J. Fox.
Right. But when I think of the invigorated youth, it's the kegger from Teen Wolf that comes to mind as the most immediate example of like the archetypal 80s party. And you're absolutely right. And now, certainly there were precursors to that. I mean, you can go back to Valley Girl with, of course, Nicolas Cage, Valley Girl. And
Valley Girl is the best, the all-time best out of all of the 80s teen movies.
Like 3/4 of the movie is the party.
Right, exactly. Yeah, the party scene at the girl's house where they're eating the sushi.
Yeah, right.
And it is a great. I mean, it not only is it an entertaining film, but it is. I mean, if you want to see the ultimate in '80s mass consumerism.
Yeah.
That is the film to watch, man. That is a great example there of. I mean, just the opening scene alone when they've got the Bonnie Hayes song "Girls Like Me" playing, and it's just the girls at the mall shopping, and they're ringing multiple things up with the credit cards. Just
well, now fast time.
They get to the last credit card, and it's maxed out. They can't spend anymore.
Well, that was the thing. The mall, and the party was like the characteristic features of the high school movie. What do you the high school '80s teen movie? What do you make of the invigorating party scene there in all these '80s films?
Well, I think what they did with a lot of films, especially if you look at the history, which you can actually go and look at some of these histories, especially with YouTube now, you can see a lot of interviews with directors. And you take someone like Amy Heckerling, which I've seen, which she was the director of Fast Times at Ridgemont High.
Right.
And I watched a couple of interviews with her, and she actually took to going and interviewing high school students to make her films. And of course, she was a protege of Terry Southern, which, if you're familiar with Terry Southern, he wrote Dr. Strangelove with Kubrick.
Mm-hmm.
And he also wrote The Magic Christian. And so Heckerling was a protege of his, and so we're talking about culture creators, culture generators.
Right.
And one of the least recognized as a cultural shifter was the movie Clueless, which was directed by Amy Heckerling, because the phrase that we use so loosely now, whatever, comes directly from that movie.
Well, it does, but it was also, I mean, when I was in California in the 80s, like you guys were talking about on that podcast, so many of the things that were common in the 80s, like phraseology like that, the Valley Girl language, right? I mean, that when I was in California in, say, 1984, 85, that was the way you would hear people talk, and you would hear people say things like, whatever, like...
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the way that something that is colloquial gets exported to the rest of the world is through culture and movies.
All right, well, hold that thought, John. We're going to be right back here in a moment. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood with John Adams of Hoaxbusters Call. Welcome back. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. I'm talking to John Adams of Hoaxbusters Call and the Afternoon Commute. And we're talking about Hollywood history, and what better place to start than the 80s teen movie, 80s keggers, straight out of Teen Wolf, Valley Girl, Fast Times at Ridgemont High. So many examples of this. And we were just noting how what you see in culture creation through the Hollywood machine, the Hollywood propaganda complex, is what spills out into the country later. So when I was in California in the 80s, as I was telling John, I remember Motley Crue being really popular, and I remember rap music being popular. And I moved back to the South in about 87, 88, and nobody had heard of rap music yet. It was complete. I was already listening to Run DMC, and no one knew about rap music yet. So just another example of all of this, as John was saying, spilling out into the rest of the country later as kind of a incubator test tube.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was plenty of rap music movies that came along in the 80s to promote and to proliferate that culture out into the rest of the world as well. But going back to the teen movie, the teen movie goes all the way back to the 1950s.
Yeah.
And, I said this on many talks, but prior to the 1950s, there wasn't a word for teenagers.
Yeah.
And that is actually a creation of the advertising industry. Exactly. To create a marketplace for people in the ages between 13 and 19, and that is the actual history of the word teenager. And so they even did studies back then. I'm trying to think of the name of it. It's
it makes me think too of the way, I mean, marketing strategies still work this way, where you have big companies. For example, I saw a thing where Jeep was talking about how the reason we've been so successful, this is on a YouTube clip, was because we created the culture of the Jeep. And so there's forums, and there's people who put Jeeps together, and there's people who go to meetings for Jeep enthusiasts. And they created this entire so-called culture around the Jeep. And that's what you've seen all along, and you're giving a great example of that from the creation of the idea of the teenager, which then cuts out a niche market that you can not just create the market, but also then later sell objects to that market.
Oh, absolutely. I've played guitar for 25 years, so that's all it is marketing, little tricks and little knobs and doohickeys for your guitar, and you've got to have six guitars. Your life's not complete without them, and that's why they have massive warehouse-sized guitar centers everywhere to sell you all that stuff. But this is interesting. I got this book here with me. It's called Rebels and Chicks: A History of the Hollywood Teen Movie, and it's like probably a sociology book that they give, sell to you at way overpriced in school.
Yeah.
For like a media course. And it said, at first many advertisers were skeptical about the youth market. They didn't believe teenagers were as reliable and consistent as their parents when it came to spending money. But that all changed when a young marketing specialist named Eugene Gilbert started researching the spending habits of high school and college students. His ongoing study proved that the youth market was indeed worth exploiting because teenagers on the whole were serious consumers who established a preference for a certain brand of names at an early age and had a say in their families' purchasing decisions. Many big name companies, including Pepsi-Cola, Philip Morris, and Johnson & Johnson, took Gilbert's advice and hired the marketing firm, the Gilbert Youth Research Company, to help them go after a piece of the $9 billion he estimated boys and girls under the age of 20 had at their disposal every year. Okay, that was in the 1950s. And so then you started to see magazines like 17, Modern Teen, Teen Parade, Teen World pop up. Then you started to see the teenage movie pop up. And so you see like The Wild One with Marlon Brando, Rebel Without a Cause with James Dean, of course. And it's this idea, it's, proliferating this idea, one, that there's juvenile delinquents everywhere. And the study that said that there was juvenile delinquency created the idea that juvenile delinquents existed. There was the study done that there was I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. They did a study, and it said that there was over 1 million juvenile delinquents in America. And so, of course, police started looking for juvenile delinquents. Well, Rebel Without a Cause, the opening scene takes place in a police station with upper-middle-class juvenile delinquents. Of course, the famous, scene in, James Dean where he said, "You're tearing me apart!"
That makes me think of, if you can even go back to the beatnik genre of films, and there were a bunch of films in the 60s that dealt with the beatniks and this festering rebel underground of you think about even Ed Wood made films that had this beatnik theme. If you've seen something like Sinister Urge, where there's this burgeoning pornographic industry that's underground and is tied into rebellious youth, and the cops are involved. And then if you've watched, say, Mystery Science Theater episodes, then you know that there's a whole bunch of this beatnik genre that they did, in these bad B movies in the 60s. And that would then, kind of transform into these films like Easy Rider and, this type of stuff, right?
Absolutely. That all comes out of the sci-fi horror genre, but not the high sci-fi horror genre that was, kind of geared more towards, I guess, an adult audience. There was a teen sci-fi horror genre that was created in the 1950s with films like I Was a Teenage Werewolf,
yes,
or Teenagers from Mars.
Also Mystery Science Theater episodes.
Right, and so the films that you're referring to, which I guess would be more of the Russ Myers type films of Faster Pussycat, Kill Kill Kill,
yeah,
and
right.
Beyond the Valley of the Dolls,
yeah,
which are which are bizarre films.
Well,
pornographic,
and you've got the motorcycle gang element too.
Right, and then Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, which is a sequel to Valley of the Dolls, has every single thing you could possibly think of, including satanic ritual.
Yep. Right.
And it all takes place in L.A.
And Roger Ebert, baby. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a whole lot of interesting things that were being marketed to teens all down through the time having to do with rebellion, and the classic scene in Rebel Without a Cause is having to do with the parents. The scene with Natalie Wood and her parents, and the scene with James Dean with his parents. It establishes that these are, and this, the science fiction horror film kind of does this subconsciously as well. I've read articles about that before on the call. That if you have the teenagers from Mars or either the teenage werewolf, it establishes that the teenager is this person from Mars that you'll never understand. Exactly.
And it's funny you said that, because I don't mean to change the subject, but I just read an article about how the X-Men and the idea of the mutant is this favored image amongst homosexuality, right? Or homosexuals, I should say. So the homosexual niche of the population has this special affinity for the X-Men precisely because the X-Men is the mutant, better than you, posh sort of rebel who you'll never understand, and it's something, this is elite class of its own, and that's exactly how the X-Men are portrayed in the film. Of course, Ian McKellen stars as Magneto, but I'm not saying that I know for certain that the original intent of the X-Men was to be homosexual. I'm just giving that as another example of what you're saying, that the idea of this fictional creation is something that you identify with as this so-called alternative group.
Right, and there was always rumors that James Dean was gay.
Oh yeah, right.
And the Russ Myers films are rife with homosexuality. There's always underlying homosexuality with all of this idea of rebellion as well, because anything that's sold to you is sold to you to overthrow the existing culture. Whether you agree with that culture or not is not the issue.
Right.
The issue is that there was an established culture that existed in whatever form you want to, take it as, and there was a concerted effort to overthrow that culture in any way, shape, or form. We are seeing the...
Well, John, hold that thought. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. I'm talking with John Adams of Hoaxbusters Call and the Afternoon Commute, and we're getting into the topic of creation of genres, niches, and even intergenerational divisions and splits. So the very idea of the rebellious youth and the rebellious teen actually comes out of the Hollywood system, presented through fiction, science fiction, and fringe, I guess even kind of Mondo video type stuff, Russ Meyer films, biker films, right? All this stuff out of the 60s and 70s. And you were talking about, well, finish your thought there, John. I hated to cut you off.
Well, like what we're seeing today, we've mostly accepted homosexuality, whatever you think of that. Whatever, put your personal opinion aside and be objective for a second. I'm talking to the listener, not to you, dude.
Oh, you just go on with it, John. I love it when you talk to me that way.
Yeah, whatever you may think of homosexuality, it's been sold to you through movies and television and music and all sorts of imagery. And one of the ways that it was sold to you was through humor. That's primarily the vehicle that homosexuality was made a comfortable subject,
right,
to be brought into the household or to be brought into the movie theater. There's always a funny gay character down through history.
Yeah, Laurel and Hardy. I've even heard Charlie Chaplin's kind of supposed to be a gay type guy.
Well, yeah, they're very feminine, So that's already an aspect there. Is you've got this feminized male. I think now that you bring that up, I think my first experience with the feminine male who annoys you so much was when they replaced Curly with Joe on the Three Stooges.
Yeah.
And Joe was like this effeminate, like weirdo, and I hated watching those particular episodes. So there's always these, one person who comes to mind, which I said that your Terrence McKenna actually sounds like a Paul Lynde impression.
Yeah.
And Paul Lynde was an openly gay comic in the 1960s who portrayed Uncle Arthur on Bewitched. And he made no bones about it, especially when you would watch Hollywood Squares. He had no problem bringing that into the living room for everyone to see it. And then another good example would be Three's Company. John Ritter has to pretend that he's a homosexual so he can live with two women in a cinema apartment, because at that time that would be looked at as inappropriate. But as long as he's gay, it's okay.
Well, don't forget. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, as long as he's pretending to be okay, it's okay to watch it.
Yeah, right. Well, don't forget Peter Lorre, right? He's obviously gay in, for example, Casablanca. Mr. Rick.
Hey, get that little weird guy away from me.
Yeah. Oh, Mr. Rick.
What are you hanging around with me for, huh? See?
See. Yeah, it's a great point. It also makes me think of the 80s phenomenon, tying in exactly perfectly with what you're saying about the party and the kegger. The Teen Bop magazine, right? I remember when I was a kid, you'd go in and I'd be looking for something like Mad Magazine, and I would just see like 20 different styles of this same carbon copy Bop magazine with Jonathan Taylor Thomas and Zach Morris and, all these A.C. Slater, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And and that is ultra feminization.
Yeah.
Even if you're expecting a female to purchase those magazines, those male through that medium, the male has been feminized. So the girls are now attracted to feminized male. Plus, that could go into a whole other niche of that particular time period, considering, as you mentioned, Motley Crue and bands like Poison are wearing lipstick and eyeshadow and all sorts of things. But going back to the 1980s teen films, bringing it up into the 80s, there's an interesting thing that takes place, because you do have a divide between two types of teen films. You have, like we mentioned, Fast Times at Ridgemont High and Valley Girl. Those are kind of early. Those are the early part of the 80s, like 1981 and 83. And so it's kind of the decade of the 70s kind of carries over a little bit. It hasn't quite kicked into high gear with the, the neo new wave fashion and
right.
the neo, it's still kind of got one foot in the disco era. Okay. And so you also have this little genre that's like the teen sex film.
Yes.
Like
Porky's is, yeah.
Porky's and Revenge of the Nerds and
Meatballs, yeah.
Yeah. So these two things kind of merge in a very sophisticated fashion by the time 1984 comes around with the emergence of a man by the name of John Hughes.
Oh, yeah.
And John Hughes was a writer for National Lampoons. He also suspiciously enough worked in advertising before that for a big ad firm.
Yes, I've read that.
And then, and he became the head writer for National Lampoons, which, if you look into the history of National Lampoons, they're a very elitist organization. They were started at Harvard.
And of which Katy Perry was last year inducted as a member in a secret ritual.
Oh my goodness! So there you go. I mean, that she would be the epitome of the 80s film girl.
Well, that's why in her videos, TGIF, she plays the 80s teen girl.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what you have in the John Hughes films, which are very interesting films to analyze, because what you have, and I've seen interviews of John Hughes where he actually addresses this subject, because people actually notice this full head on, and it's impossible not to notice this when you go rewatch those films today, and that is that adults are stupid, children are smart.
Yes, absolutely.
And that is the invigoration of the youth character. Is not necessarily invigorating or empowering the person watching it, but at least through the medium, through the dream world of movies, you're feeling empowered when you walk out of the theater and you see John Bender jump in the air with his fist raised. Mm-hmm. And, Simple Minds comes on with, Don't You Forget About Me.
You know what else, John? I'll tell you another neat little tidbit. If you watch Uncle Buck and you pay attention to the screenplay, now John Hughes did write the screenplay as well, Buck will continue pretty consistently, and I'm not making a whole lot out of this because I don't really, put too much stock into Marxism or anything like that per se as a real thing, other than it being this sort of college kid ideology. But you'll notice that throughout the film, Buck will consistently make communist statements. He will laudingly praise Marxism and communism, and in that film, Buck is just kind of this ne'er-do-well, roustabout, layabout type character. Who ends up being kind of the dark, accidental hero, and that's what you consistently see that very thing in John Hughes films. And I don't have any knowledge of whether John Hughes was like a Marxist or anything, but there is a pretty consistent, curious promotion of Marx and Marxism by Uncle Buck, of all people.
Yeah, I would agree. I would also agree that what you see in the John Hughes films is very similar to tactics used by Marxists.
Yes.
And I don't know for a fact that he was a Marxist or anything like that. But he was certainly given a script to follow for his entire career.
Yeah.
Because everything from Animal House, which he wrote, all the way up to Home Alone, which he also wrote,
right,
is all about adults are stupid, children are smart.
Yes.
Right. So, and even Home Alone. Kevin's dumb parents leave him behind, and then he spends the entire movie making buffoons of dumb adults trying to break into the house.
Even the crooks, right? Even Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern are idiots, right?
Right. And then he took it one step further in Look Who's Talking.
Ugh.
Right? So where even the baby, the baby who's just born is smarter than the parents.
Well, that's because there was a ghost in the background of that scene that was directing it all. It was the ghost of Ted Danson in blackface. If you remember the big scandal of Ted Danson wearing blackface.
Of course, yes, the Friars Club scandal.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, another, Ted Danson, of course, famous for another emasculating movie as 3 Men and a Baby.
That's exactly. Oh, I'm sorry. I was thinking of 3 Men and a Baby, and that's where the infamous bullshit story of the ghost in the background is from.
Right. Yeah, that's what. Look Who's Talking is the one with Kirstie Alley and John Travolta where the babies talk.
That's right. Followed by the genre of Baby Geniuses and a bunch of horrible baby movies. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the theme that runs through the 1980s, and John Hughes. I mean, Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Everybody.
Hold that thought, John. We're gonna take a break here. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood, and I'm talking to John Adams of Hoaxbusters Call and the Afternoon Commute, and we're getting deep into 80s mania. Welcome back to Esoteric Hollywood. Listen, I want to remind you that you can actually pre-order my book right now if you're listening to this. My book is Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film. And I don't take the usual sleaze route of analyzing Hollywood history. I go with symbolism, philosophy, and the esoteric. So if you like Esoteric Hollywood as you're listening to it, be sure and check out my book on Amazon. You can pre-order it. It'll be out June 1st, 2016. Also, be sure to check out j.talknetwork.com to get organic supplements as we get closer to the Christmas season. My guest, as I said, is John Adams of Hoaxbusters Call and the Afternoon Commute, and we're getting into John Hughes films, something that you probably didn't expect on Esoteric Hollywood, but very appropriate because there are some interesting aspects to John Hughes films, and John was just giving us a really excellent treatment of that. Continue with your thought, John.
Well, we were getting into the classic Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Bueller.
Yeah.
Ben Stein came to my college a couple of years ago. Actually, I went and heard him lecture. It was pretty funny.
Oh yeah. Before he was the teacher on the Wonder Years, and before he was an economist.
On Fox, right?
On Fox, yes. So Ferris Bueller's Day Off, we see the same thing. Ferris Bueller's parents are dumb, and the principal is dumb. Everybody who works at the school is dumb. The guy who works at the restaurant is dumb. All the adults are dumb, and these teenagers are pulling the wool over everybody's eyes the entire movie. Not that it isn't an entertaining movie and it isn't funny, but it's just it has programming in it that runs through every single John Hughes films, and then.
Well, don't forget also there's quite often in a lot of these films, and not just John Hughes films, but in many of them is sort of the absent parent role, right? So we started in the 80s to see the single parent, the absent parent present in a lot of films. Now it's quite common. Pretty much every sitcom, Disney movie, TV show, whatever, it's dysfunctional family, split up family, single moms. Just think back to Alan Ruck playing Cameron. I don't think you ever see Cameron's dad, right? Cameron is completely fatherless, even though he has this ghostly father.
That's correct, and this actually starts in the 60s With the beach party movies.
Oh, okay.
Annette and Frankie Avalon and Annette Funicello. In the beach party movies, there are no adults. It's all teenagers.
Interesting.
And so when an adult does show up, it's kind of like they're bringing the party down, you know, right?
Oh, yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I can't remember which beach party movie in it, but there's actually a Freudian psychologist who comes to study the beachgoers and study their habits and their you know, it's pretty bizarre.
I'll tell you a great example of that is, have you ever seen? It's one of the Mystery Science Theater episodes, and it's the Attack of the Giant Teenagers, or I forget the exact title of it. It has a young Bo Bridges in it, and it's where all the teenagers get infected with a toxic goo of some sort, you know, the classic toxic goo thing, and they become like 50-foot teenagers, and they all rebel against the parents.
Yeah, well, you know, there's also to counter your point there, we'll just trade movies. Like you be Pat Buchanan, I'll be Tom. What's the name?
Village of the Giants is what it is. I couldn't think of the name of it. It's 1965 Village of the Giants with a young Bo Bridges.
You be Bill Buckley, I'll be Gore Vidal. How about that?
I don't know if I can affect my New England accent on the spot here. I probably could do a William Buckley. I've never tried, but I'll just work on my fake British accent.
Okay, so Bo Bridges, of course, the brother of Jeff Bridges, the father, of course, being Lloyd Bridges, who was implicated in the HUAC era. There allegedly was ratted out all of his communist buddies. But I counter you with The Computer Who Wore Tennis Shoes with a young Kurt Russell.
Okay. Yeah.
Are you familiar with that film?
Is this one of those? I know that Kurt Russell, you know, kind of started out in a lot of those Disney movies back in the '60s. Is that one of them?
Exactly. And so once again, the teenager is smarter than everybody else. Like, I can't remember what happens. He's in like a lab.
Yeah.
There's an explosion, and all of a sudden, the computer, and it's a great transhumanist film as well. The computer somehow gets into his brain. Yeah. And then he becomes like super smart and is able to, you know, outdo all the teachers at the school and all that stuff.
Yes, and in fact, if we were to pick a kind of culmination of that genre, the first thing that pops in my mind is the 1986, 5 or 6 Real Genius, right, where Val Kilmer is the part of this crew of kids that are recruited for MIT. And by the way, that actually has a pretty conspiratorial plot, because what they actually figure out in the film narrative is how the Pentagon is working on directed energy weapons.
Well, I will counter your real genius, and I will see your real genius with my War Games with Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy.
Absolutely.
1981, which I think you've even talked about this before, but once again, what you see here with this, and you start to see this progression, that they start including teenagers into like movies about geopolitics and warfare.
Shit, man, Ferris Bueller's hacking the fucking Pentagon.
Right, exactly. And I will raise your real genius with Caps and Red Dawn.
Yes, the Wolverines, absolutely. Charlie Sheen and Patrick Swayze taking on the communist invaders, absolutely, and winning, by the way.
Right, I know. But see, once again, it's teenagers fighting the communists. Teenagers save the day. Remember that movie Caps with Tom Cruise, where they take over the military school?
Yeah.
Yeah, same thing. Same kind of idea behind that. And then a little bit later on, you see, you brought up in the previous thing is like Goonies, where you have, once again, there's no parents.
Yeah. Yeah, the single mom and this crowd of rowdy, loud kids who not only solves ancient mysteries but also saves the town from the evil land developers, right?
Right. So then we move on into different areas a little bit later. It gets a little bit more serious because see that generation was growing up. Remember, by the time the late 1980s, 1990s comes around, so you got to get a little bit more serious and start taking on some more serious issues. So you see, like the John Hughes crowd starts to evolve into these more like adult, and I don't mean adult as in pornographic. I mean like more adult situations.
Well,
with relationships and
St. Elmo's Fire. St. Elmo's Fire is that way. Yeah.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was getting to. About Last Night, For Keeps, those type of films, and so what it did was you had these films where these teens were put into these adult situations, but yet they were teens, right?
Oh, don't forget, by the way, a perfect example, Risky Business, where Tom Cruise's character learns that he doesn't get into Princeton based on good grades, but on running a prostitution ring.
Right, exactly. Which he was in a film prior to Risky Business called Losing It.
Yep.
Which wasn't about losing it like going crazy. No, it was about guys trying to lose their virginity.
Reminds me of fucking Quentin Tarantino when he was talking about. Have you seen this fucking Top Gun? Top Gun it's the fucking faggiest movie I've ever seen. It's all about fucking fags. It's faggy, all right? I'm gonna say Top Gun is faggy, and I don't give a fuck, okay, what you think about it, okay? Fuck you. That's what he says. Like he's talking about, and if you watch Top Gun again, it's like, wow, it actually is kind of like a gay Navy recruitment film there.
Oh yeah, I wouldn't doubt it. I prefer Iron Eagle.
The Air Force recruitment film, right? Don't forget, little Nikita is also an Air Force recruitment film.
Sure, yeah, I remember Little Nikita, of course. Yeah. What was it? What were we? Oh yeah. So also you get into these genres, like I was saying, it gets a little bit more serious, and these people that you've grown up with as these teenagers who took on the tough, adult themes in their teenage world now have to take on the adult themes in their adult world.
Yeah.
Right. But that can't last too long because you can only take so much of that being an Arrested Development adolescent. So we move off into other genres of the supernatural, like The Lost Boys and Flatliners.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And Young Guns. And the fantasy film, the fantasy movies.
Yeah, I'll tell you too. I've watched Lost Boys probably 30 times, so I can quote you that script, by the way. But we're gonna have to take a break here. I'm talking to John Adams of Hoaxbusters Call and the Afternoon Commute. Definitely check out their stuff and their previous podcasts and interviews. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. Welcome back to Esoteric Hollywood. This is Jay Dyer of jaysanalysis.com. We're talking to John Adams of Hoaxbusters Call in the Afternoon Commute, where he and Chris Kindle break down media, hoaxes, psyops, fakery, as well as all kinds of other interesting and fringe and occult arcana. Yes, they get very deep there on that show. But not in a fanciful... Rip Torn kind of way, but in a I don't know where that came from, but we were talking about, in a good way, we were talking about Hollywood and 80s films, and this has been one of the funnest, I think, Esoteric Hollywood episodes I've done yet. And John is really blowing my mind with this 80s Arcana, something that I'm very much a patron of. I support the patronage of 80s Arcana. And we were talking about Lost Boys, and I was telling John that I've seen the film so many times that I can quote the script. And my buddies and I, we actually devised a way to kill yourself through Lost Boys, and that would be if you play the drinking game where you take a drink, not of liquor, of beer, every time the word Michael, every time Michael is said in that fucking script, you would die halfway through that movie, right? By the time you're hearing about Nanook, you would be dead. Nanook, because Michael is said so many fucking times in that movie. But yeah, Lost Boys, it takes us into this very esoteric occult theme of West Coast vampirism, Satanism, and things that, in my opinion, were probably really going on. And there's just a treasure trove of weirdness that you can actually draw out of that film. And I actually have an analysis of Lost Boys at jaysanalysis.com if you're listening and you want to check it out, where I argue that it is kind of a veiled reference to a satanic sort of coven type thing out on the West Coast. John, what do you think?
That is possible. Another West Coast film you might want to reference that came about in that particular era that was getting on the serious side and has remnants of the Brat Pack, and including one of the actresses in the Lost Boys, would be the film Less Than Zero with Robert Downey Jr. and Jamie Gertz.
Oh, yeah.
And, that once again, another thing is you have the upper middle class, kind of cocaine class of the 1980s, and he ends up becoming a male prostitute that gets pimped out to rich people.
I have a friend. I have a friend whose brother is buddies with Robert Downey Jr. And he told a funny story about midgets and cocaine in a private jet. But I probably shouldn't say more than that. But suffice to say, it's pretty funny. But I'm glad you brought up Robert Downey Jr. and the dark themes of certain 80s movies. It makes me think of something like Heathers and Better Off Dead.
Heathers, once again, allegedly a satire, but it's a bizarre, twisted satire.
Kind of a Columbine preparation, almost, I think.
Sure. Funny enough, a friend of mine, his cousin is actually in that movie.
Oh, wow.
You know, one of the jocks who gets killed in the beginning?
Yeah.
And that he makes it out that they're gay. Christian Slater.
Right.
Yeah, whatever the bigger, more Bubba type guy, that guy, that's my friend's cousin. Anyways, yeah, it's a bizarre film. It's a twisted film, and like you said, it's definitely foreshadowing Columbine, which of course was a staged event, and there's lots of films that foreshadow Columbine, and of course films that came out after Columbine to fill in all of the gaps for you with the information, like Gus Van Sant's Elephant. Heathers. What was the other one you mentioned?
Better Off Dead with John Cusack is a good one.
With John Cusack, yeah. These, like you said, these more dark themes, but they're veiled in humor.
Yes.
And so it's a good way to sell. Humor is such a great way to sell all sorts of different things. And even when you get into the 1990s, you really, not to get off the subject of the occult, but just to digress for a second, humor is what, like in the 1990s, say with like American Pie, speaking of the teen movie, the reinvigorated teen movie of American Pie, basically introduced a whole generation of people to the bathroom humor that would become the Judd Apatow movie.
Yes. Good point. That's a great point.
So yeah, it's no longer, bathroom humor has always existed, but now comedy is solely bathroom humor. There is no other type of humor. It's all bathroom humor.
Exactly.
Now. It's all movies and apparently, so I've heard, I haven't seen it, the film with James Franco and Seth Rogen where they, Korea, whatever that one is about North Korea.
Oh, the interview? Yeah, I still haven't seen the interview either.
Yeah, apparently there's projectile diarrhea in the movie, so that's where we're at in this day and age with humor. But getting back to the occult, humor is a great vehicle to sell a lot of ideas to people, and so what's that movie? So you see a lot of movies from the 1980s where there are occult themes, but they're veiled in humor,
right?
And a lot of it has to do with witches.
Yes, it's a great point. And I'm glad you mentioned Flatliners too, which I think is right on the cusp of, like 91, because that actually is, I mean, it's not, I don't mean to distract from the topic of witches because that's a great topic, but I was just thinking of Flatliners, and there's a hilarious scene, it's a bad movie, by the way, it's not very good, but there's that great scene, I think, where it's Kiefer Sutherland is reliving his sins, so to speak, and then there's this little black girl on the train that cusses him out. Do you remember that scene?
I don't.
It's hilarious. I mean, it's probably a 1 million view clip on YouTube just because that scene alone is so funny. Because it's just a little.
I'll go look it up.
Yeah, and if you're out there listening, look up the Flatliners cuss out scene. I mean, it's classic. It's the most. It doesn't even fit in the movie. It's so funny, But yeah, so back to the witches, your 80s witchcraft is a good topic.
Oh yeah, it's all over the place. I mean, it really kind of kicks off with Bewitched in the 60s. Elizabeth Montgomery, of course, being a very nice-looking witch for the time period, and that's kind of the theme that runs throughout. Witches in Hollywood is that they are always beautiful, but they're a witch. So there's this thing that you have to deal with, that the character always has to deal with. Well, this person's a nice person, or this person, this is a hot woman, but she's a witch, and so even if you go and if you go watch Bewitched, there's so much occult stuff in those old episodes. It's so funny. I mean, even that they live at their address is 1134, which if you're familiar with that, that's or it's 1164. It's 1164, which is if you flip the numbers upside down, it's hell. Mm-hmm. Right. So it's 1164 Morning Glory Circle.
Wow.
Right, and of course, a morning glory flower is always affiliated with the occult because of, if you look at a morning glory, it's very beautiful, but it's a very destructive plant.
It's also used as a hallucinogen as well, right?
Right, exactly. And if you see the flower itself, there is an upside down star in the middle of the flower, so that's why.
Right. Good point.
So there's a lot of a whole bunch of interesting stuff all over those Bewitched episodes. But yeah, that kind of stereotype moves up on into the 1980s and even into the 1990s when you and I were in high school. Of course, you had the it gets a little bit more serious. But the one I was thinking of off the top of my head from back in the 80s was your buddy Jack there and the Witches of Eastwick.
My buddy Jack and the Witches of Eastwick. John, I'm sure you're going to be happy. My wife, Wendy's a confirmed horror film fanatic. You know what? As speaking of Jack, if you watch Pump Up the Volume with Christian Slater, you can tell that Christian Slater is 100% trying to be Jack Nicholson. He acts and talks just like him.
Did you just read my mind?
Well, the reason I was thinking of Pump Up the Volume, which is like, what, like, is this supposed to be like a preparation for Alex Jones or something? What is Pump Up the Volume? But when you watch Pump Up the Volume, by the way, which features Mila Jovovich and a young Mila as his original girlfriend, who's mega hot there. But I was thinking of his
and Samantha Mathis.
Yes, I was thinking of Christian's sister, Helen Slater, and Helen was in Legend of Billie Jean. And to tie it in with the witchcraft theme, is that is a mega ultra feminist film.
Oh yeah, big time. Same thing. Plus, Helen Slater was also cast as
Supergirl, right?
Which is another feminist movie too, as well. So, she seems to have been picked for that role for whatever purpose. But yes, Christian Slater obviously doing the Jack Nicholson impression to catapult his career. I mean, unfortunately, it only led up to being in the movie Cuffs.
I was going to mention Cuffs, dude. That was my next. I swear, you're reading my mind. All right, we're going to take a break here. we're having some laughs here on Esoteric Hollywood, talking to John Adams of Hoaxbusters Call. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. I'm Jay Dyer of jaysanalysis.com, and you're listening on talknetwork.com. We're talking to John Adams of Hoaxbusters Call, and John was just talking about the transition out of the 80s party phase as we follow our Brat Pack and later pseudo Brat Pack heroes and favorite icons such as John Cusack and so forth as they move into the 90s, and we see the emergence of the grunge and alternative scheme. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, you start to see that theme kind of run through the movies. Like I said, there's the movie Single that totally promoted the whole Seattle grunge scene and even included cameo appearances by band members who, were as always, you're sold these ideas that these guys are kind of anti-corporate, anti-commercial. But,
well, you know what that reminds me of at the time, even, I remember, all my buddies, we were all into grunge and alternative and all the different bands, and we really liked Sub Pop record productions, and then it was like a big deal when Sub Pop got bought out by some big company, right? And it was like, oh shit, they sold out, man, they sold out.
That's right. Yeah, that was a big deal at the time. Yes, Sub Pop's got an interesting history. That whole scene actually has a very interesting history in and of itself, and I kind of touched on a little bit on that when I did a talk on punk music. You can find it at hoaxbusterscall.com.
I mean, I believe you sent me, maybe even there was a long article, or somebody sent me about the history of grunge and Sub Pop. It was a fascinating piece. I may have come across it on Wikipedia. I can't recall.
Yeah, a lot of people in and around the scene with very interesting backgrounds. We won't go off into that, but yeah, that's what you kind of see is this kind of full court press to move people out of the 80s into the 90s, into the new wave. And what do you see pop up in the 90s, Jay? Well, you'll remember from high school, you and I, we were inundated with the safe sex propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what you heard about, and that's what you saw all over the movies. It was all about safe sex.
Well, this ties into the AIDS psyop, which I believe is a psyop, and if you pull up that Pentagon document from 2001 or 2 about information warfare that Rumsfeld signed off on, that I believe Global Research has posted the documents. But if you read through that psyop document, it actually refers to the AIDS operations of the 80s and 90s as a psyop.
Yeah, believe AIDS exists. So I'm sure I think HIV exists, but yeah, AIDS in and of itself is a completely and totally fabricated disease, and it was really scary for a lot of people, and you had all the movies to go along with it to scare you. Even Forrest Gump scares you because Jenny dies of AIDS at the end of the movie. But yeah, that's what you saw throughout being promoted, is that, you know, safe sex. This was also, in turn, doing the exact same thing that they did in the 80s, except it was making something taboo. You know, it's like, oh, well, you know, safe sex and abstinence. There was all of this banter back and forth about, what's the proper thing for young adults and teenagers at the time, right? That was a big topic back in the day for you and I.
Yeah.
And so yes, safe sex made it okay because, you know, you're wearing the condom, and they used to pass out condoms at my high school. They used to pass out condoms everywhere.
I went to U2 in 1997, and they were playing in Memphis, and it was the Pop tour, if you remember the Pop album, and they were literally just raining out to the crowd U2 Pop condoms.
Wow, U2's one of those interesting bands because not only because of Bono being, you know, some sort of intelligence op for a charity, because U2 was, when they first came out, they claimed that they were a Christian band,
right?
And then somewhere along the line, they decided to do away with that image. But yeah, that was promoting the whole idea of safe sex and all that type of stuff. And one of the biggest movies of all time to scare an entire generation, that being yours and mine, our particular section of Generation X, was the movie that was so raw, so hardcore, so in your face, Kids.
Oh yes, the Disney production Kids. Yeah, I'm
exactly
very familiar with this. I grew up in my high school years listening to the soundtrack. Actually still play the Folk Implosion songs from the Kids soundtrack, so nothing gonna stop the flow, right? So yeah, I know, yeah. And what was Kids about? Oh, well, Telly has AIDS, and he's basically banging everybody and giving them all AIDS, which is completely preposterous.
Yes, and, you know, it was basically another film out there to expose you to, like, kind of a heart, you know, because the sex in movies today is like, I mean, they might as well be doing it.
Right. Well, there was a Gus Van Sant movie that was like one of the first mainstream films, I think, where they actually did do the fellatio in the film. I think that's right.
Right. Right. Yeah. And so Kids. I can't remember the name of the director of the Kids, but he's the guy who did Gummo, I think.
Yeah.
And he has a pretty strange story as to how he got financed to make that movie, Kids. He said he just walked up to some guy in Central Park, and he just happened to be a movie director, and he wanted to direct his movie after he told him the story idea that he had.
Right.
That's the story behind Kids. But anyways, yeah, it's kind of one of those first movies where they have kind of hardcore sex scenes, and so it's kind of preparing you for what's to come as far as the, no pun intended.
Well, you know what's weird is somewhat. I don't personally know him. I've kind of reached out to, because I have mutual friends. Is Harmony Korine is who wrote Kids, and he's actually in Nashville.
Oh, that's the guy I'm thinking of. That's the guy who had this very strange story of that he had the screenplay and he met a guy in Central Park, and the guy said that he financed the movie. So
yeah, I've interviewed his buddy Chris Crofton, who's in Harmony's other weirdo movie, Trash Humpers, right? So Harmony likes to make these like really these kind of like trashy type films like this.
Right, he makes Spring Breakers.
Exactly, right, which is roughly, I guess, riff raff. I'm not really sure. It seems pretty obvious to me that that's riffraff, but I was going to tell you too, and I hate to keep bopping around, but my mind just kind of shoots in a bunch of different directions. Empire Records is another one of those alternative music movies that ends with, fighting the man and then the big party at the end.
Oh yeah, big time. Yeah, that was that's a pretty standard film for that time period. And another one, that you just reminded me of, which is actually a very good movie, because this director experiments with the stream of consciousness flow, is Dazed and Confused by Richard Linklater.
Yes, very much stream of consciousness, absolutely. Surrealism, waking life, absolutely.
Yeah, and so Dazed and Confused kind of toys with this, where there's these kind of which he did that with his movie Slacker, but he kind of toys with this stream of consciousness thing. But it's interesting because I've talked about this before in some of our calls, and it kind of gets fragmented into a bunch of different calls, and never just a direct talk about it. But
also with a hot Mila, by the way.
Oh, yeah, she's in that too, right?
Yep.
But yeah, the idea of selling you on the idea of 90s ideas through a nostalgic film.
Mm.
So it is a 90s movie set in the 70s.
Ah, okay.
Okay, and so this has been done for many, probably since Hollywood started.
Right.
Is that you set something in another time period, and then you talk about current issues.
Yes. Okay.
And this makes you more relaxed when you're receiving the information, because you're thinking, oh, well, this is nostalgic. This is, talking about the 1950s or the 60s or the 70s. So when you're getting all of your upgrades for what your generation is supposed to be,
yes,
through this film, you're viewing it from another time period.
Oh yeah. It makes me think of that 70s show. All right, looks like John has cut out, but you're listening to Esoteric Hollywood, and we've been deconstructing quite a few 80s films here. A plethora, really, a cornucopia of 80s party films, all the way up to sex romps, and maybe even the deeper meanings of 80s esoterica. Welcome back to Esoteric Hollywood. We're talking earlier with John Adams of Hoaxbusters Call, and if you heard last week's show, I had the other half, Chris Kendall, on the show of Hoaxbusters, and we were having a blast talking about 80s films, and we got from 80s parties to 80s esoterica, and then into 90s alternative and nihilistic nihilism, right? And wow, we just had a blast. We were cracking up the whole way. And if I was thinking about 80s films again for the last couple segments here, and it made me think that there's quite actually a few films that you could really dive into that deal with these deeper esoteric themes. And I thought I might mention as well the Ridley Scott film Legend from 1985, if you remember your 80s Arcana. And I wrote a piece a few months ago with Jennifer Sedini, and we were discussing the fact that, even though Ridley Scott says that he's not very happy with Legend, right, nor does Tom Cruise, I think if we think about, the essence of the 80s, we think about things like Top Gun, Risky Business, Star Wars, E.T., Indiana Jones, and we think, some of us at least, of Legend, right? And there's quite a bit of esoterica actually going on in legend, in my view, right? You could kind of class this with Dark Crystal or Labyrinth or Neverending Story. I'm sure everybody has seen these films, right? This is if you're a kid of the 80s, like most listeners probably are. And if we recall, so the story begins with Tim Curry, who's playing the devil here, and I think he may have even won an award for the makeup in this scene. He was a fantastic devil. And he's not the devil himself, right? He's just a demon known as Darkness. And so right away we kind of have this Masonic imagery of dark and light, right? Where the good we're going to see is actually, in this view, the flip side coin of evil, right? The Gnostic view, right? And the beastly temptation of lust, right, is spoken of as symbolized by darkness, this character. Even the purest of heart, we're told, has the darkness of lust within us. And then darkness just summons one of his goblins, this annoying character Blix, who's going to do his bidding as he expresses his nefarious urge and carnal desires to be satiated and to destroy innocence, right? And so the accomplishment of the act is ultimately and intimately going to be tied to a ritual action at the climax of the film that will involve the removing of the unicorn's horn and the sacrifice of the unicorn. The destruction of innocence and the consuming of the energy of the innocence through blood sacrifice is signified both through menstrual blood and the blood of the broken hymen and in sexual intercourse. I think that the film is so profuse with sexual innuendos that right away we're supposed to make that connection. So functioning as a kind of antithesis to the red, right? If we think about red as kind of corresponding to the base chakra, carnal desire, the dual-headed demon Darkness, he's sort of the flip side of the unicorn, whose white signifies sexual purity and innocence with a single horn. The unicorn is also kind of enigmatic or representative of sexual energy and can be used either to create or destroy, to protect or to impale the horn, that is, right? And sexual energy, I guess, in the orgasm can be viewed in a similar way and is generally by most religions viewed, as sacred. And so the power of the orgasm is perceived to be the same power of both death and creation. Think of the le petit mort, the French term for the orgasm, the little death. Just the theory of what we've been talking about, for example, was explored by scientist Wilhelm Reich in his cloud busting or orgone energy experiments. And then Carl Jung, we think, explains the symbology of the unicorn in relationship to alchemy or the notion of Mercury. For example, Carl Jung says the unicorn in alchemy is the great example of what is chosen to demonstrate how the symbolism of Mercury is intermingled in the traditions of pagan Gnosticism and Christianity. The unicorn is not a single, clearly identified entity, but more specific is a beast with a horn, or the alicorn. Examples are given often in literature, but especially those found in texts like the Chemical Wedding of Christian Rosencrantz, in which the unicorn and the lion and the dove appear. And all of these, of course, are symbols, he says, of Mercury. Reference can also be made to medieval art, in which the images of the Virgin and the unicorn appear together. Now, for Carl Jung, the unicorn, also has a kind of sexual significance too, as he goes on to explain the masculine force, with the horn, of course, being phallic. But when we get back to the film, so we think about the initial relationship between Lily, played by Mia Sara, Ferris Bueller's girlfriend, and Jack, Tom Cruise, is a juxtaposition then between a feisty sort of Puck from Midsummer Night's Dream from Shakespeare, right, and then the fairy tale archetypal princess, right? So the princess is from the city, she's from the town. Jack is, of course, a woodland nymph, I guess we could say, who, dances about like the Beastmaster, talking and singing to the animals. Now, Jack abides by the code of nature, we're told, right? So he's also kind of like a pan character. And there's interesting opposites here, as one would, I think, assume that the princess would, not be interested in the wild forest boy, the peasant boy. But Lily is, we discover, approaching her time. And Jack is ripe with nature. It's in the middle of spring. What are we talking about? Well, we're talking about sex here, obviously, right? And so the symbolic sort of allegorical scene of the touching of the unicorn, touching the horn, I think is pretty much about Lily's sexual desire. Do you trust me, she says, right, as she frolics off to touch the forbidden unicorn phallus. Excuse me. Now, when the unicorns appear, we see two of them paired together, and they're striding down a stream is itself quite sexually provocative given the angle of the camera. We see the water of life flowing, and in alchemy, water is often associated with the powers of emotion and intuition. And so what we have here is a presentation of sexuality as a temptation, and then through the power of emotion and intuitive desire, leading Jack and Lily to experiment, so to speak, to get frisky beneath this huge tree of life. A classic image of sacral fertility. Both of these images recall, as we said, the Carl Jung quote above. And I think it's also curious that the prancing of the unicorn is very similar to another Ridley Scott film that features the prancing of a unicorn in an seemingly out of place sequence where Deckard, played by Harrison Ford, the replicant, has a dream of unicorns dancing through fields, much like Ridley Scott's Legend. Maybe they use the same scenes, I don't know. But from there, we see Lily run off, and she's starting to cause some trouble. She shouldn't have touched the unicorn. And Jack says, don't touch him. Leave him alone. Of course, Lily goes and touches. Blix, then the goblin, who is sent to do Big D's bidding. Big D. Wonder what that means. Shoots the unicorn with a poison dart, right, which releases the forces of chaos, we're told. Chaos and darkness in the world. A sort of mythological presentation of the fall, right? And Lily freaks out, goes crazy, runs to the cottage, right? She's thrown her ring off of a cliff, and she's doesn't know what to do. She's gone into histrionics and hissy fits. And then, of course, Jack is going to be the good lover boy, and he jumps off the cliff to regain the ring. Now, what is the meaning of this weird clock scene where everything freezes? This also seems a little bit out of place, but I have a great quote here that I'm going to read from the esoteric writer Julius Evola, where he's going to explain the cyclical meaning of the cosmic clock and what freezing might perhaps mean. Freezing is, of course, imagery that signifies in literature and film most often winter, death, right? The time of decay, being immobile, frozen, much like being in a grave. You're immobile. You can no longer move about. And of course, spring, as everybody knows, emblematic of new birth, sexuality, life, right? So what we see from Julius Evola here in his analysis of the clock and the cosmic cycle, I think is going to be applicable to what happens with Lily. And it's precisely because of the menstrual cycle and the connection of the menstrual cycle to nature itself that Evola's quote is going to be so appropriate. And you can find much more in my analysis of Legend if you go to jaysanalysis.com and type in Alchemy and Eros in Ridley Scott's Legend. But when we come back from the break, I'll get into this Evola quote, and we'll see how this gets pretty deep. I'm not going to beat around the bush here. It's pretty damn deep, but I'll try my best to deconstruct this for you. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood, and I'm your host, Jay Dyer of Jay's Analysis. We had John Adams on earlier, and now we're deconstructing Legend, the 1985 Ridley Scott film. You're listening on TalkNetwork.com. Welcome back. You're listening to Esoteric Hollywood. We had a great, laughy, jokey conversation earlier that got pretty deep into a myriad of 80s Arcana references and social engineering and culture creation through the process of moving into the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and today in terms of Hollywood film. Right now, I'm breaking down Ridley Scott's Legend, and I mentioned Julius Evola, who has a book called Eros and the Mysteries of Love, the Metaphysics of Sex. And Evola is a very fascinating esoteric writer. Here he's talking about the cosmic clock, and I'll read his quote. He says, "We find here a similar conception of cyclical development, symbolized by the cosmic clock and its course. The first phase of the clock is the entry of God into nature, of the sun into the process of becoming, and of the male into female. It is the woman or the Shakti, the lowest point of the clock, that predominates this phase. And at the figure 6, which corresponds to the lowest point of the clock, that is the descending arc in which woman dominates man and matter imprisons the spirit in the depths of its entrails. We have the limits here of the abyss. When we reach these limits, we either die or we are reborn into eternal life. And it is the point of the dangerous passage or turning wherein this great trial is held. After that, the themes of sexual and magic appear because of the trial, in which should also consist facing the woman in the same spirit as the tantric principle of victory over the bad through its transformation into the good. The woman is thought of as the gate through which it is possible to enter the sphere of life or death. In the fall, sensual pleasure became the magnet which draws a man towards a woman, not for the conquest of life, which equals God, but for the conquest of death, which equals Satan. Eve became the battlefield and the struggle between life and death. At the decisive point of this trial, man sees his bride again and is invited to immerse himself in her, the female, once more, not in order to enter into the realm of death and becoming, but in order to become able to leave that realm and maintain awareness of his own being instead of dissolving. In this context, the woman is seen as the gateway of heaven and as the essential element for freedom. From the end of the descending phase 6, the victorious male next finds himself reprojected to the starting point of the cosmic clock's cycle, freed from matter and consecrated as king. This is the rite of the second wedding, and this coincides with that of the formation of the Messiah." Wow. Profound esoteric reading of The Clock by Julius Evola, and perfectly applicable to the frozen clock scene in Legend. Now, Jack, as we saw, nose dove. He did him a Greg Louganis right from the top of the cliff after the moon ring, and it's the moon ring, of course, which is feminine, vaginal. And he dives into the abyss. We saw, of course, the abyss mentioned in the Evola quote. And as the seasons change rapidly, the water freezes, winter falls across the land, and then the unicorn we noticed that Lily touched is unfortunately captured and emasculated. He's dehorned, a dehorned-icorn. The allegory, then, of innocence lost, chastity discarded, and the death of sexual purity in Jack's concession to Lily. Now, this explains why the unicorn that dies is the one that is male. Right? There's a male and a female unicorn. The female survives, of course, and Blix presents the horn as an offering to darkness. The demon then replies, "The destruction of both unicorns is needed, the male and the female. And in particular, the ritual sacrifice of the virgin female, since it is a female that possesses the power of creation. Right? Now that line shows you that my analysis is correct. Jack's descent into the abyss is signified in the same way as what Evola described in the quote, where upon emerging ringless from the water, he experiences a kind of psychosexual emasculation, having lost his horn and Lily, which recalls the myth of Osiris, the lost phallus in primeval and mythological origins, right? And only as Osiris's disembodied form is reassembled into a higher unity and includes the phallus, can the process of restoration of the masculine occur. It is within the legend, right, that this same narrative is played out as Jack must mature from adolescence into manhood. He undergoes the trial of losing his essence. What are we talking about here? I think you get the picture, sexually. Due to Lily's folly. And then imprisoned in the wintry, watery abyss that now encompasses his entire world. Now, our abyss interpretation is also confirmed by the fact that darkness, his opening salvo is, "In the beginning, there was only darkness and the void." The abyss, right, from which the order of created beings emerges in Genesis 1. Before Lily is captured, we see the abuse of power, right, where they're kind of playing around with the horn, Blix and the demons. And we see then that darkness's lair is a kind of massive dead tree, a reverse of the tree of life, which, if we were to read this Kabbalistically, would perhaps correspond to Deat, right? The sphere of the Kabbalistic Sephiroth, right? Or perhaps to non-being, or perhaps to hell in some sense, right? And it's in an underground series of caverns, right? Which is where we're going to discover Lily is going to be seduced, right? And then we see the references to Dante here with the Inferno underground, and as well as where the sacrifice of the female unicorn is going to occur. Now, one of the most interesting scenes in the film is this orgiastic dalliance between Lily and Darkness, where Darkness sort of mind controls Lily, right, and her alter persona sort of pops forth, and Lily becomes this kind of liberated gothic babe, right, who engages in a little bit of dancing and tryst with Big D, and Big D almost overcomes her resolve. And both scenes, of course, occur in the context of the underworld labyrinth, right, connected to the subconscious that we've seen so many times, as I pointed out in my Shining analysis, and as well in my analysis of Labyrinth. Now, it's, I think, curious as well that when Lily is dancing with the devils in this interesting choreography scene, her black-clad shade begins to dance with her. She's dancing with herself. And she comes under the seductive spell of Big D. And under the sensuous mind control of Darkness, she merges with her shadow, acquiescing to the pomp and luxury that tempts her, right? As well as her ego flattery. Women do love jewelry. Drawn into the material, Lily adorns herself with the diamond necklace that alludes to Ezekiel's description of Lucifer as a bedazzled cherub, replete with emeralds and precious stones. This is Ezekiel 28:12 through 14. Now, consistent then with the theme of good, evil, light, dark is duality, Gnostic duality, right? Dialectical tensions, masculine versus feminine, light versus dark, innocence versus sex or desire, spirit versus flesh. And even in the climax, it's Big D's destruction that results in the explicit proclamation, "What is light without darkness," right? Big D is conquered through Jack stabbing him in the solar plexus, the ego center, with the unicorn horn, the death of ego by desire. Darkness disappears, off into the abyss, and then from the light of the sun, we see the sort of stars coalescing and him disappearing. As I said, the little death, right? Le petit mort. Many, many things, I think, more esoteric could be said about the film, and I go into much more depth in my analysis if you want to check that out, Jay's analysis. But I guess I'll leave you with one quote, and this is from Anna Schaffner, Modernism and Perversion. She writes, "Furthermore, observing and studying the history of modernity in general, I never stopped being appalled at the desacralization of life in the context of modernity, as a consequence of which the modern subject lives in the dimension of time separated from eternity, that is, under the aspect of death. Thus, the modern subject has gradually developed a perverse relationship with eros and death, which, according to Freud, are the two basic instincts. In the context of desacralized life, in terms of modern living, death is a taboo and repulsive issue. In the sense of that modern subject, by living separated from the absolute, he cannot manage the issue of death and desperately tries to forget it, evade it, and silence the issue, while simultaneously fusing death and eros into a necrophiliac perception of culture manifested through necrophiliac aesthetic values. That is, grossly skinny fashion models, asexual cyber freaks, right, as opposed to ancient Greek erotic archetypes of Aphrodite or Apollo. Artifacts that emanate disharmony and decadence are preferred. Necrophiliac sexual attitudes and necrophiliac working patterns, which can be seen in things like this obsession with sensationalism and violence, or working for a living, satisfying one's temporal needs and desires, right, and not being concerned with anything spiritual. Very applicable to the film Legend by Ridley Scott. Much more could be said, as I said, and if you like what you hear, be sure to check out my book. I'm the author of the forthcoming title, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols in Film, which can be ordered from Amazon or Trine Day Publishers. And my name is Jay Dyer. I run the site jaysanalysis.com, and if you like the philosophy you've heard tonight, be sure to subscribe to my philosophy lectures at jaysanalysis.com. For $4.95 a month, you can get a philosophical education apart from statist brainwashing. This has been Esoteric Hollywood with my guest, John Adams of the Hoaxbusters Call, and a brief breakdown of Ridley Scott's Legend. Until